Now I'd love to introduce our next speakers. First up, we have Robert Branson. Robert Branson is the president and CEO of the Multicultural Media, Telecom and Internet Council, which is the MMTC, which is a nonpartisan national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and preserving equal opportunity and civil rights in the mass media, telecom, and broadband industries, as well as closing the digital divide. Branson received his law degree from Harvard University and his undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia. Joining him in conversation, we have Joi O. Chaney. Joi is a domestic legal policy expert, political strategist, and former chief of staff to the United States Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. After leaving the Senate, Joi relaunched JOI Strategies, a consulting firm that develops strategies for organizations and companies seeking to achieve justice, opportunity, and inclusion for America's underserved communities. Let's see, Joi began her career at the former Bach, Robinson, and Lewis PLLC and the Democratic National Committee. Joi is a graduate of Howard University and Harvard Law School, so welcome to Joi. They will be joined by Evan Marwell, who is the founder and CEO of EducationSuperHighway, which is a leading nonprofit focused on closing the digital divide in America's most unconnected communities. In 8 years, EducationSuperHighway closed the digital divide in America's K-12 schools, connecting nearly 47 million students in 99.7% of America's classrooms to high-speed broadband. Evan is an honors graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Business School, an advisor to high-potential social entrepreneurs, a board member at Direct Relief and Recidiviz, and the board chair of MyAgro, an NGO helping smallholder farmers in Africa move out of poverty. And they will all be talking with Licy Canto, a veteran of public policy, corporate strategy, healthcare communications, and diversity and inclusion. Licy is managing director at APCO Worldwide's Washington, D.C. office headquarters and the Mid-Atlantic region lead. Licy is a well-respected expert in public health and healthcare policy with nearly 3 decades of experience at the international, national, state, and local levels across the nonprofit, philanthropic, corporate, and government sectors. I will also love to introduce you to our amazing own Kathryn Zolowski. So I will turn the floor over to you and you can take it away.
Thank you, Meg. Good to see you again. And good day to the thousands of you who are joining us for yet another Diversity Reboot Summit. I'm Kathryn Zolowski, as Meg said, the co-founder and president of Power to Fly. And this time around, we're focused on the larger mission of how tech can be a true catalyst for social good. And it seems like, as always, our first keynote will be led by my dear friend, he can turn on his camera now as I introduce him, advisor and leader of so much social goodness, Licy Canto, who is the managing director for APCO Worldwide in Washington, D.C. He will be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern for another star-studded panel. So please make sure you sign on for that or check the schedule. For today's talk, Licy has brought together leaders who are closing the digital divide at the top levels of government and policy, as Meg pointed out. Robert Branson, Joi O. Chaney, and Evan Marwell. And it's only fitting that we kick off the summit with a core and yet very challenging problem to propagate social good. So Licy, I'm going to let you take it from here. And thank you once again for kicking us off.
Kathryn, thank you so much. And welcome to our audience that is listening and viewing us from wherever you are. Welcome to the Diversity Reboot 2021 series. I'm glad to be joined here today with Joi Chaney, Robert Branson, and Evan Marwell for a powerful conversation about broadband access and really what it means to have inclusivity and equity and diversity within the tech industry. Over the course of this summit, you'll be hearing from innovators and entrepreneurs building tools, platforms, and communities that leverage the power of connected technology to drive change and to advance progress. But in order for that to all work, for marginalized communities in particular, to benefit from these types of tech innovations, those communities must be first connected. And as the late John Lewis, congressman in civil rights, once said, access to the internet is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And so for the next hour, I'm really excited to welcome to the Power to Fly family table, if you will, 3 of our nation's most impactful leaders doing extraordinary work in and around this issue for so many years. We're going to have an important, powerful conversation about digital inclusion, how we can equip unconnected households with connectivity, with devices, with digital skills that they need to fully enjoy and benefit from the tech ecosystem, but really to benefit from what it means to engage and be part of the 21st century in all the ways that we are going to talk about. So I want to dive right in. Joi, Chaney, in particular, welcome to the Power to Fly family table here. The National Urban League, of course, has been a leader for many years to fight to advance digital inclusion. And earlier this year, of course, you released a comprehensive set of proposals to really get at the issue of digital equity. And that effort, of course, is known as the Lewis-Latimer Plan. To start off our discussion, let's dive a little bit into hear more about what that approach means, the work that you're doing around digital inclusion, and giving our audience a sense of sort of the work and the legacy of the National Urban League on this issue and the leadership that you all bring to a more diverse and equitable future. Joi, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Licy. Thank you so much. Thank you to Power to Fly and all of the organizers, including Tim, who's not on here, but who helped put this event together. I'm thrilled to represent the National Urban League in talking about these issues, which frankly, we put out a report recently, and we're so thankful to everyone who's helped lift it up. But we've been talking about this for a long time, right along with MMTC and so many others who have been, sounding the alarm and saying that our technology boom is really important. We're very excited about it, but it really stands to expand the gap between the haves and the have-nots if we do something about it, and if we are not intentional about equity. And it won't be enough even for everyone to be given all the same access. We actually have to do more to ensure that communities of color and communities with lower incomes actually benefit from the technology boom that we've been in since 1996, really. And so that was sort of the premise by which we began the Lewis-Latimer plan for digital equity and inclusion. And we launched it at the beginning, the research at the beginning of the pandemic, because we could see all the things that we have been saying. When we did our digital divide State of Black America report a couple of years ago and talked about it, all of those things we talked about, the things that MMTC talked about, that perhaps Power to Fly talked about, were coming to fruition, and we could see it all of a sudden overnight. The third spaces that people used for their internet access went away with little warning. And all of a sudden people were, in parking lots trying to gain access to the internet. They didn't have libraries, and they didn't have schools, and they didn't have workplaces to do that work. And so what we realized is we needed to be aggressive, and we needed to be intentional about dividing a plan that would be a unique and comprehensive look at the digital divide. And we focused on availability, which we know is important, but we wanted to also talk about adoption issues. Adoption gaps, which include affordability issues, which are what predominantly plague communities of color, people who have internet all around them, but they cannot afford it. We also wanted to talk about access to digital literacy, or we call it digital empowerment, right? We wanted to talk about the folks who have access to the internet, right? They could probably afford it, but they don't know how to get on, and they don't know how to utilize it. And some of those are older Americans, but some of those are younger Americans who, because they haven't had access to the internet, aren't using it and don't understand all the ways in which they can utilize it, and it can benefit their lives. We also talked about utilization. There are government services that should be easily provided through the internet as if they were private sector services, but are not. And that means that the people who rely on those services don't have ease of access in interacting with the federal agencies and the state and local agencies that make their lives possible. And we saw that when so many people were unable to file for unemployment benefits during a pandemic, when that should have been something that was clearly able to be done over the internet. We saw government systems shut down and not be able to keep up with the demand. And then the last piece, because like I said, we are the National Urban League. We care a great deal about closing gaps to economic opportunity. So there are the gaps that of economic opportunity that not having broadband create, but then there are also just the gaps of having a technology system that doesn't employ enough people of color and is not intentional about employing them. Having lack of diversity in the boardroom, lack of diversity in the ownership circles. We want to see those gaps closed. And we want to see our corporate partners be intentional about closing those gaps. So we looked at all 4 of those areas when we put together the Lewis Latimer plan, and I look forward to talking about some of the solutions as we go through today.
Thank you very much, Joi. As a reminder, please put your questions in the chat. We'll be taking them momentarily. I want to go to Evan. Joi talked about so many important aspects of what we're addressing here today, particularly around sounding the alarm and closing the gap. Your organization, EducationSuperHighway, has worked for many, many years to do just that, if you will, to get every school in the country connected to high-speed broadband service. I think many of us, especially parents of young children in the school system, know full well what happened when the pandemic hit and education shifted online for just millions and millions of students almost overnight. Tell us a little bit more about what you and the organization did to respond and what you've learned throughout this pandemic, if you will, that could help inform us on how we better tackle digital divide more broadly.
Well, thanks for having me here today. It's great to be on this panel. I had the pleasure of watching Joi on another panel either last week or the week before, and she was inspiring. So it's really great to be here with her today and with Robert as well.
Good to talk with you too.
Licy, as you said, EducationSuperHighway, the nonprofit that I founded in 2012, spent 7 years going from 10% of schools in America to 99.7% of schools in America having broadband. And we were actually getting ready to shut down, having finished our missions, sunset the organization, when the pandemic hit and we sent 55 million kids home. And when that happened, we started getting calls from people around the country, from policymakers in DC, from governor's offices that we'd worked with across the country, from superintendents of schools. And they all basically had the same questions, which were, how many of my kids don't have internet at home? Turns out it was north of 15 million. And what do we do about it? Because school districts had never actually purchased internet access for kids at home before. And so it was a whole new thing. So we spent the next 8 months working with them really on solving 3 problems. The first was, how do you figure out who is and isn't connected? And that remains a critical problem, not just in schools, but for all the communities that Joi was talking about. You know, one of the biggest challenges that we have as a country is, if we want to solve problems, we need data to tell us where the problem is so that we can focus our resources and focus our efforts. The second thing we helped them with was figuring out, okay, who do we buy from? And in our work connecting schools, this turned out to be one of the biggest barriers. Most school districts didn't realize all the different options that were available to them. And importantly, they didn't realize what they should be paying for those options. And so by creating transparency around that for school districts, schools were able to drive the cost of internet down by 90% over a 5-year period. So creating transparency for communities about who they can buy from and what services are available is really important. And the third thing that we did is we helped school districts start to think about the adoption problem. And Joi pointed this out, you know, just making broadband available is one thing, making it affordable is a second thing, but there's a real challenge around building awareness, building trust for programs, helping families sign up for these broadband services. These are all major roadblocks that sit in front of them that we have to overcome. And so during the pandemic, we've done a lot of work in all of those areas. And there's a couple things that we've learned and that I want to sort of reemphasize about what Joi said. So the first is, you know, we talk about the digital divide. And historically, the narrative has really been one about access. It's about building infrastructure to rural America. But the reality is that of the 29 million households in this country that don't have internet access, 2/3 of them, 20 million of them, don't have it, not because there's no internet available to them, but because they can't afford it. And, Joi said something great on the last panel that I listened to her, and she said, Washington's been very good about addressing the issues of people who don't have access, and now it's time for them to address the issues for people who can't afford it. And the good news is that we're starting to see moves in that direction, whether it's the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program or the Emergency Connectivity Fund program. Those are great steps in the right direction for connecting these communities. But as I'm sure Joi will tell us later, they're not permanent. They're temporary programs and they need to be made permanent. So that's one thing, is that we really have to focus on this affordability issue. The second thing, though, that we learned is that to solve the affordability problem, we really need to make internet free. We've had affordable broadband programs available across the country for the last 10 years, and we still have 20 million households without internet access. And so the bottom line is that, if people can't afford $10 a month or $15 a month, we need to make this free. And there's, interestingly, two ways we can do it. We can do it like we do it in airports, where we just bring free Wi-Fi networks to places where people are. And that means largely apartment buildings and community centers and places like that. Or we can provide subsidies. And if we provide subsidies, we then also have to do the work of understanding the adoption problems that I was speaking about before, and really helping folks overcome those issues so that we can get them signed up. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of what we learned along the way is policy. And there really, there's some great work being done right now on the infrastructure bill. It's important, though, that our leaders don't ignore the affordability problem as part of the infrastructure bill. And part of the way they can do that is by, adopting some of the language from the Bridge Act around allowing infrastructure funds to go to the communities, the low-income communities and communities of color where access is available but not affordable, to invest in free Wi-Fi networks, and setting those communities on the same level of priority as rural America, where we need to build out access. And then finally, the last thing we have to do, as Joi said, is we do need a permanent subsidy. And I don't know that will be addressed in the Infrastructure Act, but we need to keep pressing on Washington to make sure that they create a permanent subsidy for broadband for all Americans.
Thank you. Robert Branson, you have been working on these together with MMTC, these issues, of course, these challenges, and in the trenches for many, many years. Evan talked about broadband access and broadband adoption, particularly in low-income communities. Tell us a little bit more about what MMTC has been doing to address this issue. And of course, Evan mentioned the emergency broadband benefit, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But how have you and MMTC been working to help more families, particularly underserved communities, get connected with broadband? Robert, the perennial message for the pandemic. You're on mute. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much for inviting me here this afternoon. I'm very happy to be with my co-panelists and you as a moderator and the group Power to Fly. It's a very important time that we have. Of course, it's always tough when you have two great speakers going in front of you and you have to follow up. So I'll try to do my best and add something to the conversation. If you don't mind, I'd like to take 1 minute or two to sort of set the stage a little bit about what the emergency broadband benefit is, because we've all sort of been talking about it, but no one's really said what it is yet. So I don't know how many people in the audience, understand what it is or what it isn't. So then I'll talk about what we're doing with it, if you don't mind. Okay. Late last year, Congress approved a COVID relief package that included about $3.2 million to establish the emergency broadband benefit. Now, that's a lot of money. Of course, that's a big deal, $3.2 billion. What does it include? Well, it basically makes sure that eligible households can receive discounts up to $50 a month for broadband service, or up to $75 if they reside on tribal land. Participants also receive a one-time $100 discount for a computer or tablet. I know that's not a lot, but that's a start to get people up and running, because frankly, you can't do what Joi was talking about, filing applications for jobs, unemployment benefits, with a cell phone. You need a computer or laptop that had the functionality. That program went out, and the FCC partnered with about 24,000 groups, including groups like ours and the other two participants here, Boys and Girls Clubs, school districts, YMCA's, food banks, pretty much anyone they could connect with. And after that, we have seen with all the people working on this, the program actually has been quite successful. They've been able to sign up a lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of people have not signed up, and that's where we come in, and I think, and then these other groups come in. How to get those people who are afraid to sign up because, one, they think this is a government benefit that won't last long and therefore will disappear, and they don't want to sign up for something that's going to be here today, gone tomorrow. Number two is, these are people have heard about Bill Gates' check that would come in, and some people think this is sort of like that is going to go away. I still haven't gotten any money from Bill Gates, by the way, but but so what we're trying to do, so we decided at MMTC, what's the best way we could get the message out, using our connections. And therefore, we came up with a program called Black Churches for Broadband. And what we've done is we've reached out knowing that, particularly in the Black community, inner city, and even rural community. I come from a very rural area in Virginia. And the churches where people get information, either from the pastor or from the other people in church. And people trust the church. So that's what we do. We've had I think up to 4 convenings now with the Black Church. We have one tonight at 7 p.m. Joi has been helping us. I think she's going to help us again tonight on or other ones we have. And then next week we got a call to action. So we will have people, we'll have these ministers, pastors, whatever we refer to them, going out into the community and talking to people and telling them about the program. We also have a call to action where we're asking them to write to their legislators to let them know how important the program is, and more importantly, how we want to keep the program going. In other words, it's the emergency broadband benefit. It needs to be a permanent or something similar to what a permanent broadband benefit is. In other words, enough money there that you don't have to worry about allocating every year through a congressional process in order to get funding for this. So we've got that going on. We've also teamed with other groups like Alvanza and OCA to basically bring in the Latino groups and the Asian groups. And we've had meetings and tried to get information with them as well. So like I said, it's a large process. We are working as hard as we can to let as many people know what we know. But frankly, we can't do it alone, nor can Joi do it alone, nor can Evan do it alone. We need help from Congress. We need them to appropriate for education. We need them to work hard to help us with adoption. And that's why the people who are watching this today, you can do your job too. You could make sure that the member of Congress knows, is well aware of what's needed going forward. So I'll end it with that note, call to action. So thank you.
Robert, thank you very much. Again, thank you for everyone who is submitting questions in the chat. We'll be taking them here momentarily. You've heard a lot of information thus far in terms of the efforts that are taking place across the organizations that Joi and Evan and Robert are helping to lead. We've talked a lot about what efforts exist at the federal level to drive equitable and digital inclusion. But I want to ask now, what can the private sector do, and what are examples of efforts that are showing real meaningful progress in addressing digital inclusion and equity? And I want to go to Joi to talk about what some of those private sector opportunities are, and what are the models that we should be looking at. Uncle Sam is one approach, and we're going to get into some of these federal legislative efforts that are taking place, but what can the private sector do, and what are they already doing to tackle these issues?
Thanks, Licy. One of the things we know, I won't say company names here, but there are companies who have low-cost programs, right? Low-cost, high-quality programs, and I think we know who some of those are. We need more of that, right? We need to make sure that people are able to get the most for their emergency broadband, any subsidy that they are currently having. And then for those who even don't get the subsidy, right? We want to make sure that there are fair pricing for programs, and to those companies who are doing that, really my hat goes off to you in expanding the numbers of people who are able to afford broadband in the home. I think what Robert has said is really a point worth repeating, is that your cell phone, which is really important, is not enough. You can't do everything on your cell phone. Licy, Evan, Robert, none of us on here do our work purely from our cell phone. Our kids don't write papers on their cell phones, right? We have to have computers to do that. And indeed, most of us are on computers now. So you have to have that. And so the more that these companies are doing that, is having low cost programs with high quality is important. The other thing is some companies are getting into the making sure that we have device adoption, right? Making sure that people have access. Know that here we're talking a lot about broadband, but people also have to have devices. The FCC has, in this past stimulus bill, we've been able to provide people not just access to broadband, but also access to devices. And so as companies begin to look at their equity work, making sure that people can have computers that work is really important. And in some cases, yes, having phones that work too, right? Because there are some folks who don't even have that. That's really, especially in some of our elderly communities, that's very important. The other thing is, there are companies who are handing out, working with school districts to hand out free, what do you call it? What's wrong with me? Hotspots, right? So that people can have expanded service where they would not otherwise have it. So there's a lot that corporate America can do and is doing. The other thing is spreading the word about the emergency broadband benefit. That is really important. Believe it or not, the United States government doesn't have a lot of advertising dollars that were committed to letting people know about the EBB. And I know that one of the things that we are fighting for when we talk about a permanent program is to make sure that they have the dollars that are intentionally allocated so that they can spread the word, and that we're thinking about ways to do it, attaching it to other types of benefits that people get. Because obviously you have to be able to get it. And what some would say is these programs aren't utilized in the way that we would have thought they could be utilized. But how are people going to find out about it? They don't have the internet. So we have to be intentional about getting out there and making sure that people find out about it. And also, a lot of folks are afraid, right? They heard about Lifeline and $9. They don't quite realize that it's $50, which is what the emergency broadband benefit provides. And then even if you know it's $50, a lot of people are asking, but if it's not permanent, then am I going to get hooked on something that I will have to then take away from my kids, in a couple of months? So we have to have a sustainable program. Maybe $50 isn't the number, some other number is the number, but we have to find a sustainable program so people can rely on it, so it's worth it to them to adopt. And so getting companies to make sure that all of their customers and their potential customers, advertising is something companies do well. Getting them to be encouraging adoption of the emergency broadband benefit is essential, because we know that success here will beget success in any kind of permanent program.
Thank you, Joi. Evan, Joi raises, as we all have here today, the question around cost. You, just a few moments ago, indicated that one of the key objectives for the work that the EducationSuperHighway is doing is to make the internet free. But I point out a recent statistic from Pew that said among Americans who don't have broadband at home, more than 70% say, I don't want it. We're not interested in getting it. So how do we change the dynamic and better get unconnected adults the value and opportunity to getting online to all of the things that you and Joi and Robert have talked about? Is making it free simply going to provide that when 70+% of those who don't have it at home say, I'm not interested in getting it?
Yeah, so I think we need to delve a little deeper into that statistic. If you look at who the sample is of the 71%, the vast majority of those people are people over the age of 65, and we've known for a long time that there's an adoption problem amongst elderly Americans because they just don't see the point of having it. I think that the pandemic, which has caused so many things to change, is starting to change that as well. They've started to realize they need the internet to see their doctors. They've started to realize they need the internet to be able to see their families. They've started to realize they need the internet to be able to get their benefits from the government. You know, all the things Joi was talking about earlier. But I think if you look at more broadly the families and the households that don't have internet access, if you take out that group that's over 65, the vast majority of the people who have access to infrastructure but don't subscribe is because they can't afford it. Now, that being said, we do need to do the things that Joi was talking about. We do need to educate, make sure people have devices. We do need to educate people on the digital skills that are necessary to be able to use the internet, to be able to use Zoom and things like that. Now, what I'm encouraged about with all our work in schools over the last 8 years, we've seen a very clear pattern, which is that if you get kids access to devices and to internet, kids know what to do. They figure it out. And it's not just kids. You know, I think, you know, anyone pretty much these days, anyone under the age of 50, you know, give them a device and the internet and they'll figure out what to do. But making the internet more useful for folks is definitely something we need to do. And we do, I think, have a special challenge around elderly Americans.
Evan, very quickly, Borley Green asks on this question of free, how are cities that have free Wi-Fi, how have they shown this model to actually work? Just very briefly, since we're talking about making Wi-Fi free, how has it been shown to be working effectively in cities?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about free Wi-Fi programs in cities is that, unfortunately, in most cases, the Wi-Fi isn't where people want to use it, right? Most free Wi-Fi networks are outdoor networks, and you can use them, you know, when you're in a park or you know, walking through the streets, but that's not where people need to go to work and go to school and see their doctor and things like that. Where we've seen tremendous success with free Wi-Fi is in places like airports, like hotels, like coffee shops. And so the key is, how do we bring these free Wi-Fi efforts to the places where the people are? And the place that we're focused on is apartment buildings. And it turns out that 20 to 25% of the families of the households that don't have internet access are actually in apartment buildings. And so extending that airport model, that hotel model, into apartment buildings is a way that we can actually deliver free internet access where people need it. And the really interesting thing is, sort of coming back to your question about what can the private sector do, landlords are really interested in doing this, because landlords understand that if they provide free internet in their buildings, then it's going to be attractive for people to come and be tenants in their buildings and stay in their buildings. And so I think there's a lot of public-private partnership that can happen between cities, between landlords and others, and ISPs, to make these kind of networks available where people need them. And we've actually been doing some experiments with this. We've had pilots running in Oakland, California now in a number of apartment buildings for over a year. And we don't have any adoption problems. People know all I have to do is find the network, say yes on the splash screen, and I'm on the internet. So I think it's a really promising model, and one we need to make sure that the infrastructure bill enables more and more cities to do.
Robert, we've touched on some of the challenges and roadblocks preventing greater digital inclusion. Grace Lee asks, however, so what exactly is the problem? Is it available connectivity, or is it a lack of devices to be connected? But she goes on to say, and is it about educating people how to actually use these devices and making them available online? What's your thoughts on that? Those two questions.
Before I get that, can I go back to your statement about seniors?
Of course.
Yeah, we have been working with AARP. That's one of the groups we were on our last webinar we did, because we recognize that issue as well, that seniors are a problem. I've got an 89-year-old mother, so I know a little bit about seniors and their reluctance to get involved with things. So that's our approach to doing it, is hooking up the the private companies with seniors to talk to them and find out from a few of them what it would take. Now, as the question that Grace asked, frankly, it's a little bit of all of it. It's sort of like a three-legged stool there. You've got affordability, you got access, and you got the educational component. All need to work together, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to work on affordability by having Congress appropriate enough money. We're trying to work on educational and adoptability by getting out messages to the community. But just like when we came out with the COVID vaccinations, they didn't just put them in clinics. They had a large effort to educate everybody exactly why this is good for you and the benefits of it, and to help people who had fear of doing it. Now, obviously, it didn't work in every state, but overall, it has been quite successful in the number of people who have been vaccinated. And I think we sort of have to take, and while this issue is not as important, obviously, I'm not trying to say it's as important as a COVID vaccination. It is important, though, and I think we need to have a similar effort of education, of helping people find devices. And I think a lot of the companies I know I've worked with, because I work with a lot of these companies, a lot of the major providers over the years and various jobs. They get it, and they want to help, but they need to have an idea of what works best. And that's where I think organizations like the ones you have here are going to hopefully have more conversations with the major corporations and help them provide what the people really need. And like I said, because we're not just focusing on the FCC. And let me say right here clearly, I think what acting chair woman Rosenworcel has been doing, I think she has been fantastic. I will, and other commissioners as well, because I've seen their remarks as well. So it's not a slight on the FCC, but we need to do more. So,
Robert, of course, and then yes, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, this is why, in terms of older Americans, this is why what Robert's group is doing around churches is so important. So many older Americans have discovered the importance of the internet through wanting to engage with their churches during a pandemic. It's their lifeline. And there are people who were not going because they were a part of the sick and shut in crew, right? And they couldn't get out, that are able to get out now. There are people who would not have been able to go because they had fears about exposure, who are able to engage with their church and other churches elsewhere, right? A little moonlighting perhaps in some other institutions people are able to do now, that they have access. So what I love about the Churches for Broadband that MMTC is doing, because it's really meeting older Americans where they are and in their institutions that they are socializing in. And we have to utilize that so that when we take that poll again post-pandemic, we might have different answers.
Indeed, thank you, and all of you raised the importance of working with a coalition of organizations, public and private, which I know Robert, MMTC, and others here are doing to help expand access to broadband adoption, particularly in low-income communities. Joi, I want to highlight a portion of the Latimer plan that the National Urban League is embracing, and that you talked about before. And one part of that is creating a core of digital navigators to help unconnected Americans overcome the barriers to broadband adoption and get online. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the digital navigator effort is, and why do you think that would be successful in helping to get at some of these barriers that we've been talking about?
Absolutely. That's one of the more popular parts of the plan, right? I think everyone realizes that we need digital navigators in the same way that we use navigators during when we were trying to get people to sign up for the Affordable Care Act. We need folks who speak the proverbial as well as the literal language of the folks that we're trying to get online. People that are trusted voices within those communities. People that understand the challenges being faced to get out there. And we have, urban league chapters. We have UNIDOS US chapters. We have other, and when I say chapters, affiliates is a better word. We have folks who are getting out there and are providing direct services and are making sure that people, can actually get on, on the internet. And so we need to invest in those organizations that are doing that work. The federal government, just like it can't do all of its advertisement, it can't do all of its adoption work on its own. And so it has to invest in the organizations that are in communities already. That's what they're there for. We utilize their help on workforce development. We utilize their help on healthcare adoption, mentorship, et cetera. And so, of course, we want to have a digital navigators program, and really state and local, federal plans for actually seeing this internet, deployed, right? And broadband actually out there. We also, we have to invest in organizations who'll be able to do that work. And also making sure that they're trained too. So they're not just out there fly by night, but they're actually, trained to get people online, and to, teach them how they can use the internet and also all of the benefits that it provides for them. And it's not just individuals. I think we also have to remember, it's families, but it's also small businesses. There are small businesses who are not using the internet in the way that they need to. They don't know about the advertisement opportunities and the social media opportunities. And, there are companies that, to your point about companies as well, there are some who are really doing a great job of trying to assist small businesses in being savvier. But some of them too have, speed issues, broadband issues that they are getting, that are getting in the way of their ability to grow. And so a digital navigator program should be able to help people and meet them where they are at all levels.
Thank you, Joi. And I know part of the success story for the America's broadband industry, if you will, is performing under stress, which we know so many did very well during and as we go through this pandemic, in terms of how dealing with traffic surges and out-competing countries abroad. I want to continue to encourage everyone to ask questions through the chat. We've got a lot of great questions that I see here that we'll get to in just a moment. Evan, I want to go to you. Education Superhighway, obviously focusing on, in particular, the digital divide and all of the digital issues or lack thereof, if you will, inclusivity and equity and diversity in the education system. So when I was taking a look at the extraordinary numbers that tell the story about what's happening, particularly, for example, with 75% of 8th graders in the US who lack digital proficiency, or another study that reported 32 million US adults lack basic digital literacy skills. More than just how can we make progress in closing the obvious digital literacy gaps, which are disproportionate among underserved communities, how is that impacting our overall competitiveness here in the United States, when we have so many at that level, these levels, who are lacking the basic digital literacy? How can we achieve equity and inclusion within tech if we have these outstanding numbers still apparent?
Yeah, well, we've often talked about achieving digital literacy and other digital learning goals as being a stack, right? So at the bottom of the stack is connectivity. If you don't have connectivity, it doesn't matter what else you have, right? You can't do anything else. Then comes a device. If you have connectivity but no device, you can't really use the internet. Then comes content and applications that allow people to learn. And we've spent a lot of time working on this in K-12, and I have to tell you, I'm super encouraged by the progress that we've made. Of course, there have been all kinds of horror stories about kids not showing up for school and not having the connectivity or the devices or being able to engage. And for sure, remote learning is no replacement for being in person in your schools for most kids. But it's incredible that when we started our work 9 years ago, very, very few school districts had one-to-one programs where they were giving kids devices. Today, before the pandemic, 50% of school districts had one-to-one programs where every kid had a device. And after the pandemic, I think we're heading fast towards 100%. So we're overcoming some of those issues. The other thing is that one of the silver linings of the pandemic, in my opinion, is that, millions of teachers who sort of were thinking about digital learning, were not really sure what to do with it, saw their colleagues having some success with it in the classrooms, suddenly were forced to have to embrace digital learning during the pandemic. And what you hear from them when you talk to them about, what's going to happen post-pandemic when we're back in schools, you hear a very consistent message, which is we're not going back. We're not going back to not using technology in the ways that we learned to use it during the pandemic. Of course, we want to be in person, but there's all kinds of amazing things that we can do with technology, and we need to keep marching forward. So from my point of view, we've accelerated digital learning in this country by 5 to 10 years as a result of the pandemic, and that's going to be one of the silver learnings. And as part of that, when you're putting the devices in the hands of these kids, when you're putting internet connectivity at their disposal, when you're making the use of digital skills more and more common in the classroom, we're going to see those numbers, dramatically accelerate. And I do just want to point out that study, it's about what I would call the gold standard of digital skills. It includes things like computational thinking and people being able to do coding. You don't need to get to that gold standard, just like we didn't need to get to the gold standard of internet to use the internet as a productive tool in your life, to learn, to work, to get healthcare, to get jobs, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, thank you very, very much. The gold standard here, very important to be aware of. We've of course been talking over the last many minutes about the role of public and private sector in this powerful discussion that we've been having. There is a question that's come in regarding the subsidization and the questions that we've been having around free and access to Wi-Fi. And I want to get in a moment to some of the existing legislation in Congress that are looking at broadband investments, and of course the stimulus packages that have provided that. But the question here is, to what extent is free or subsidized subsidization leaving vulnerable communities opened up to privacy issues, and both from the public and the private sector? And specifically, the question is, how do you talk to representatives about access that doesn't create what this person viewing us right now is saying, that doesn't create disproportionate vulnerability to data exploitation? Robert, I want to go to you. You spent a lot of time working on this, of course. What's your perspective?
Yeah, and I have worked on privacy issues. Before I started MMTC, I was with Verizon, so it's an issue that I'm sort of aware of. Now, not just use them as a company, but I know a lot of people in this space. I mean, they think they and United are trying to keep the network secure, as we've seen most recently with ransomware, which has come over with the Russian hackers and things of that nature. I mean, it is a concern, and I think though the Biden administration recognizes that. I think SEC and other agencies are looking into it. Can I say right now the issue is solved and resolved? No, I can't say that. But I can say that everyone is trying to make this internet service as private as can be, make the networks as secure as can be, because much of the information going on there it's not just people chatting to each other, email. A lot of information going on involves health information, involves banking information, so financial information of that nature. So it's incumbent upon them and incumbent upon those who are providing it to make them as secure as possible. And I think I have not heard a lot of stories about anyone who has been taking the EVB or been hooked up through that mechanism having a problem so far. Not saying there isn't one, but I haven't heard of that so far. So I think right now we sort of have to trust that those who understand the IT issues are working as diligently as they can, and will make it right. I think that's the best we can do at this point in time.
Joi,
yeah, I'll just say it really quickly. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think that we would one, if we had digital navigators, that's something that we would be talking about, right? I mean, at a basic level, we have to make sure that people are protected, right? When they, you learn to drive, you got to learn to protect yourself. But just as a nation, we need to be looking at data privacy, not just, so I don't want to make this some new hurdle for new adopters. I mean, this is just something we all need to be looking at. And I'll wear my former Gillibrand Chief of Staff hat and say that Kirsten Gillibrand has a bill out there that is encouraging us to create a data privacy agency, so that we can have an updated system where someone out there who's actually looking at data privacy and making it a priority in terms of the government. So I think everyone should be looking at that bill if they have not already.
Terrific. Thank you both. I want to stick with you both here. As you and we all know that Congress is negotiating a very large $65 billion package of broadband investments as part of other work that it's doing right now. And of course, both the National Urban League and MMTC, as well as others, were among a number of civil rights organizations that sent a letter to Congress earlier this year, and the administration urging support for a permanent long-term income, low-income subsidy program. What do you think ought to be included in this bill that's not there already? And how do we get at, and how do you think that piece of legislation, if it gets at the goal that we're talking about here of digital inclusivity? I'll start with you, Robert.
Well, first of all, why not include part of the Latimer plan? It can be a good stuff. You think, Joy?
Yeah, I was going to say 65 billion is not enough.
Exactly. So I mean, that's what I'm saying. So I right. The number is I understand, and I've met with a lot of the staffers on the Hill who've been very, very responsive, and we all have the same goals. It's just finding the right bucket of money. So first thing is adding more money to it, and I know most of the money is going toward deployment. But we also need more money going toward the Digital Equity Act and other actions like that. Because we've been talking all day today, but I mean, it's great to build a network, but they won't come unless we show them how to come and show them how to use it. So that's where I would focus more the effort and put a little bit more money. The numbers I'm seeing on the Hill right now, they have been increasing a little bit more in the last week or two, and as they discuss things. I'm still not sure that they're where we need to be. They also, frankly, they need to put some provisions in there to work with groups like Evan's group and Joy's group and our group. That's not included in the legislation much right now. Finding those partners that can help spread the message out to the community. We need that. But we're doing it ourselves right now. Private partner, we're doing it. We're not getting one dime from the federal government to do what we're doing. I suspect that's the same with Joy and Evan. So, perhaps if they would look at other ways to help us get the message out, that could be very helpful as well. So,
Joi, thank you also for commenting. We have just a few more minutes left before we wrap up. What's missing in this package that, other than the Latimer plan, of course, that should be included?
Well, look, I don't want to, scuttle any negotiations, but one thing that is absolutely true is we need to make sure that in the bipartisan bill, so the core 65 billion, which actually doesn't necessarily include the Digital Equity Act, but within that core 65 billion, that it includes money for availability, sure, but also for affordability. And that we don't make it all about about availability and nothing about, we want to make sure that there is we're not looking for, equality, right? It won't be the exact same number because the problems are solved on a different scale of number, but we got to have some money in there for some kind of extinction of the emergency broadband benefit, and then perhaps we can do more in reconciliation, and perhaps you can do more, down the road, but we must have some money for affordability. That is really key. So, there's just something that we're honing in there. Won't be good if we come out here and we have solved for one community's problem, right? Rural America is diverse, by the way. Rural America includes all of America, but the vast majority of people that need help in terms of getting access to broadband are people who cannot afford it. And those people look like Robert, Licy, Evan, and I, right? They look, you know what I mean? Like they don't, they're Black and brown and Latino and Asian Americans, and they are Americans who are low income, including Caucasian Americans. So we have to make sure that they are covered. And I just can't imagine a bill that in this day and age that will come out that has solved for one problem, one community's problem, but not the other community. And that community is Black and brown and other people of color, Native populations. I just cannot, that's not an acceptable, it's not an acceptable outcome.
Indeed, and I think we all can agree on that. We can and must do more to create equity and inclusion and certainly diversity within the tech industry. We've had a very powerful conversation today. We've talked a lot about affordability and access and both the roles of the private and public sector and some of the initiatives that are taking place in both to help get at these issues. As we close, I want to ask each of you, starting with you, Evan, we just have 3 or 4 minutes to very quickly say what's the one takeaway that those listening, both now and afterwards when people watch this online, what's the one takeaway from the work that you're doing, this conversation, this people should take with them today?
Well, I think it's right where we started, which is that 2/3 of the digital divide is people who have access to the internet but can't afford it. And we need to help make sure that there are ways that we can make the internet free for them.
Great, thank you, Evan. And it seems, I think we may have lost Robert due to some connectivity issues, in fact, but Joi.
We got to get in broadband.
Yeah, we do. Joi, what's the key takeaway for you and the National Urban League today in our conversation moving forward? What do you want people to leave here with in terms of the work that still needs to be done and the work that is being done to get at these issues?
Yeah, so my key takeaway is that we have a common understanding that people in rural America don't have access to broadband. It's sort of like everyone knows it, right? It's a household understanding. We need to have a household commonplace understanding that the vast numerical number of people who don't have access to broadband are our neighbors, right? The people who live next door to us, who are trying to steal our internet because they don't have it themselves. That's crazy. And I mean that as a joke, but the vast majority of people don't have access to broadband because they cannot afford it. And those are our children's classmates. And those are our family members who say, oh, I don't need that, but it could be that they can't afford it. And we have to be focused on that. That should be a common understanding. And that in 2021, having access to broadband in the home, consistent, not going out, not falling out, that is as essential as having running water. That is as essential as having electricity. It's the modern electricity. It's the modern indoor plumbing. That's what I want, this whole experience. And I really believe due to the work of Evan and Robert, who peeled off here and Power to Fly and others, that mantra is out there and that is now the new understanding. But we have to continue making it an understanding for our friends in Congress. And so we want to encourage everyone to do as Robert said, I'll speak for him, and saying, get out there and be active on this issue as a major part of infrastructure.
Yeah, indeed. I started the talk today by quoting John Lewis about access to the internet is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. As I think we all know, he also said it's time to get up into some good and necessary trouble. And so you've heard a lot about doing just that and advocating and raising your voice and fighting for communities, especially vulnerable and underserved communities who still face many of the issues that we talked about today. But I want to thank Evan Marwell at the Education Superhighway, Joi Chaney with the National Urban League, and Robert Branson, who regrettably was disconnected with the MMTC, for your extraordinary comments and remarks today. For those of you listening, if you want to learn more about all of the initiatives and actions and steps that are being taken and that were discussed today, please visit their websites and check them out online. I want to thank you all again for joining in for this keynote discussion and wish you all very well and for the continued rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone on that amazing panel, Robert, Joi, Evan, and Licy. That was absolutely wonderful to get to listen in on. So thank you so much for that great conversation.